Here's something the tourism brochures never mention about galactic civilization. It's absolutely lousy with kings. Not the constitutional ribbon-cutting ceremonial variety either. We're talking full-throttle, divine right of rulers, kneel-or-die monarchs who believe their royal blood was personally blessed by whatever cosmic entity happens to be trending that millennium. The Zephyrian Empire had perfected this nonsense into an art form. Their society operated on a caste system so rigid it made medieval Europe look like a progressive commune. At the bottom, conquered species, naturally. Above them, various flavors of Zephyrian nobility, each more pompous than the last. And at the very top, glittering like a particularly expensive hemorrhoid on the throne of the known galaxy, sat their God-King. Now, you might wonder how exactly one becomes a God-King. Simple. You declare yourself divine. Surround yourself with enough plasma cannons to make questioning that divinity inadvisable, and wait for everyone to start genuflecting. The Zephyrians had been perfecting this routine for roughly 3,000 years, which was impressive until you realized they'd spent 3 millennia essentially playing the same boring game of cosmic Simon Says. Their latest conquest, because there's always a latest conquest when you're dealing with megalomaniacal space monarchs, was a modest human mining operation on Kepler 442b. Nothing fancy, just 47 humans extracting rare earth elements and minding their own business. The kind of people who considered a working coffee machine the height of luxury, and whose idea of political discourse involved arguing over whose turn it was to clean the communal shower. Which brings us to the submission ceremony, because of course the Zephyrians had turned even surrender into a theatrical production. Every newly conquered species got the privilege of traveling to the Crystal Palace on Zephyr Prime, where they would kneel before King Vorthak the Eternal and formally acknowledge his divine superiority. Think of it as a cosmic meet and greet, except with more groveling and significantly higher stakes for social awkwardness. The human delegation, all 12 of them, since the Zephyrians apparently believed in bulk processing, sat in the transport ship's cargo hold, blissfully unaware they were about to participate in what the galaxy considered the most sacred of rituals. The throne room of King Vorthak the Eternal was exactly what you'd expect from someone whose title included the word eternal. A monument to ego constructed from crystallized starlight, and what appeared to be the compressed remains of his enemy's dignity. The ceiling soared roughly 300 feet overhead, decorated with holographic murals depicting Vorthak's greatest victories, most of which seemed to involve other people kneeling while he pointed dramatically at things. Vorthak himself commanded attention from his throne, a 12-foot-tall Zephyrian whose chitinous exoskeleton had been polished to mirror brightness and adorned with enough precious metals to fund a small war. His 4 arms gestured constantly as he spoke, and his compound eyes reflected the light in ways that would have been beautiful if they weren't currently radiating homicidal irritation. Around the throne room's perimeter, representatives from dozens of conquered species prostrated themselves in various configurations. The Altarians had flattened themselves so completely against the floor they resembled particularly colorful pancakes. The Vegan delegates, and yes, they were from Vega, not advocates for plant-based diets, had arranged themselves in perfect geometric patterns that probably meant something deeply spiritual in their culture. Even the notoriously proud Centaurians had managed to fold their equine bodies into respectful bows. And then there were the humans, standing around like they were waiting for a bus. Tobias Krenner, a maintenance worker whose most notable achievement prior to this moment had been fixing the mining station's atmospheric recycler with nothing but duct tape and creative profanity, shifted his weight from one foot to the other and wondered if anyone had remembered to feed his cat back on Kepler 442b. Behold! Vorthak's voice boomed across the crystalline chamber, enhanced by acoustic engineering that made every syllable sound like it was being delivered by the voice of creation itself. The divine presence of your God-King. The prostrated aliens somehow managed to prostrate themselves even more thoroughly. The humans continued standing, though Marcus Webb did have the courtesy to remove his baseball cap. Vorthak's compound eyes swiveled toward the human delegation with the kind of focus usually reserved for particularly interesting insects just before they get squashed. You will kneel before your eternal sovereign. The humans looked at each other with the sort of mild confusion typically reserved for unclear assembly instructions. A few of them shrugged. I said, kneel! Vorthak's forearms gestured imperiously, and palace guards began advancing with weapons that hummed ominously in the crystalline air. That's when Tobias Krenner, unremarkable maintenance worker and accidental catalyst for galactic political upheaval, made the observation that would reshape interstellar diplomacy forever. Yeah, about that, Tobias said, scratching behind his ear with the casual air of someone declining a second helping of potato salad. I don't really kneel to kings anymore. Not since I killed the last one who made that particular demand. The throne room fell silent with the kind of absolute quiet that usually precedes either enlightenment or apocalypse. Even the holographic murals seemed to pause mid-dramatic gesture. Vorthak's compound eyes performed what could generously be called a double-take. You... what? Killed a king, Tobias repeated helpfully. Big fellow. Called himself the Void Emperor of Andromeda. Had this whole setup with floating skulls and dramatic lightning. Very theatrical. Really put effort into the presentation. He glanced around the Crystal Palace approvingly. You've got a nice thing going here too, by the way. Really commits to the theme. Now, here's where things get interesting from an anthropological perspective. See, most species in the galaxy treat regicide the way humans treat nuclear waste. Theoretically possible, but so fundamentally horrifying that even thinking about it requires protective equipment. The very concept of killing a king doesn't just violate their laws, it violates their understanding of how reality functions. Humans, meanwhile, had been enthusiastically decapitating monarchs since roughly the moment the first proto-human figured out that the guy with the fancy hat was just another primate with delusions of grandeur. The Void Emperor, Vorthak whispered, his voice losing approximately 70% of its divine authority. You speak of Zerath the Deathless? Deathless was a bit of an oversell, admitted Marcus Webb. Turned out he was quite mortal once you got past all the psychic barriers and reality-bending nonsense. Though I'll give him credit, he really committed to the bit, right until the end. The prostrated aliens began lifting their heads, suddenly very interested in this conversation. The Altarians unpeeled themselves from the floor just enough to get their sensory organs pointed toward the humans. Vorthak's exoskeleton was now reflecting light in patterns that suggested either deep thought or complete psychological breakdown. Impossible. Kings cannot die. We are chosen by the cosmic forces, blessed with— Oh, they can definitely die, interrupted Elena Vasquez, the mining station's chief engineer. I mean, they're usually tougher than regular folks. Better medical care, personal shields, that sort of thing. But once you account for the extra security measures, it's really just advanced problem-solving. I helped kill 3, added Chen Rodriguez conversationally, though one of those was more of a group project. This was the moment when King Vorthak the Eternal began to suspect that his title might have been somewhat premature. His forearms trembled as he processed the implications of standing in a room with a dozen creatures who apparently treated deicide as a hobby. "Guards!" he shrieked, his voice cracking in ways that definitely weren't covered in Divine Monarchy 101. "Kill them! Kill them all!" The palace guards raised their weapons, then hesitated as a troubling thought occurred to them. If these humans had killed actual god-kings, what exactly were a few palace guards supposed to accomplish? Tobias sighed. "Look, we didn't come here to cause trouble. We just want to get back to our mining operation and forget this whole thing happened. But if you're going to insist on the kneeling thing—" He spread his hands apologetically. "Well, we've got experience with that particular workplace dispute." What followed could charitably be described as the fastest diplomatic reversal in galactic history, or more accurately, as watching 3,000 years of political theory collapse like a house of cards in a windstorm. King Vorthak the Eternal, who was rapidly reconsidering both parts of that title, began backing toward what was presumably a very well-hidden panic room. "Perhaps," he said, his voice now registering several octaves higher than divine authority typically required, "we could discuss alternative arrangements, mutual respect, cultural exchange, a nice trade agreement that doesn't involve any workplace disputes." The previously prostrated aliens were now sitting up with the fascinated attention of students who'd just discovered their boring history. Professor used to be an international spy. The Altarian delegation had formed what appeared to be a discussion circle. The Centaurians were pawing at the ground in ways that suggested they were reconsidering their relationship with hierarchical authority. "That sounds reasonable," Tobias agreed, "though you might want to mention to your other kings that the whole divine right thing doesn't really work on humans. We've got this weird cultural quirk where we think leadership should be earned rather than inherited or declared by cosmic mandate." Elena pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "We could set up a workshop series, Practical Monarchy Management for the Modern Era. Cover topics like constitutional limitations, democratic oversight, maybe throw in a session on why building Death Stars always ends badly." The irony was beautiful in its completeness. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered dozens of worlds by leveraging their reputation for divine invincibility. Now they were discovering that their newest subjects belonged to a species that had turned king-killing into something approaching an art form. Vorthak had made it to his panic room entrance, though he was trying to make his retreat look like a casual stroll. "Yes, well, perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting. Next century. Maybe the one after that." As the God-King disappeared behind reinforced blast doors, the other species began approaching the humans with the kind of careful interest normally reserved for examining unexploded ordnance that might also grant wishes. "Tell us more about this regicide," requested the lead Altarian delegate. "Is it difficult to learn?" Marcus Webb grinned. "Well, it helps if you start with the French Revolution and work your way up from there." And that, dear readers, is how humanity accidentally became the galaxy's most feared species, not through superior technology or military might, but through the simple revelation that we'd never quite gotten the memo about kings being unkillable. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing you can tell a tyrant isn't that you're going to overthrow them. It's that you've already had plenty of practice.